You will see 5 brave, misguided writer types battling it out for short fiction supremacy. Literary Upstart! Up next, reading his story, An Obstacle to Empathy. Put your hands together for Mr. Thomas Hopkins.
I am conducting an interview with a general who is in the process of authorizing an invasion of a country that borders both his and mine. This, the invasion, is not an out-of-the-ordinary thing for him to do, which is why he feels comfortable doing 2 things at once, launching a war and chatting with a foreign journalist. The atmosphere in his office here in the marble palace of the ruling military junta is relaxed, or at least as relaxed as it can be on an intensely hot day like today. Our interview takes longer than it might under more peaceful circumstances. His telephone keeps ringing, his subordinates calling with questions from the front. He needs to take each call, although he gives me an apologetic smile at every time. He is very sorry, the general says, picking up the receiver. He is entirely all right, I say. His people are old hands at launching wars. Their problem, if you want to call it that, but the general would not, is a simple one to diagnose, say scientists back in my country. Their hypothesis is that the general's impulse to fight stems from the fact that his country's language lacks both the first person and the second person. The general holds the receiver away from his head, pointing it in my direction. I can't make out the words, but I can understand the tone, the frantic barking of a colonel out on a battlefield. The general rolls his eyes. I'm on his good side. I nod and smile. Can he believe him? The general says. He cannot, I say. How is he expected to work? He says. He has a lot on his plate, I say. The general abruptly brings the phone to his mouth. He will call back, he says. He will have an answer. In the meantime, he should hold his horses. The general slams the receiver down, wipes his damp forehead with a handkerchief, and smiles graciously at me. Where were they? The scientists back in my home country argue that the absence of the first person plural, the lack of the word and the concept of we, results in the absence of any kind of common feeling among the speakers of this language with other people. Their grammar precludes compassion. This is why, the scientists say, the speakers of this language are constantly invading their neighbors. It's why they have such an enormous prison population. It's why so many of them die every year or lose various body parts in knife fights. He was describing the outrage, I say. My country does a brisk business in the export of artificial limbs. The outrage, repeats the general, the outrage, the outrage. He pounds his open palm against his desk every time to punctuate the word, making the telephone receiver rattle in its cradle, leaving a trail of wet handprints. The press corps of my country also profits off the ongoing saga of our brutal neighbors. Hence this interview. My readers love to be scandalized by fresh reports of barbarism and stupidity. We are lucky as we busy ourselves making fun of our neighbors to have a formidable mountain range between them and us. Our artificial limb convoys make it there eventually, but we are no fun to invade. The phone rings yet again. The general sighs. The foreign reporter needs to leave him now, he says. The general is very sorry. He has had a pleasurable interlude talking with him. The pleasure has been all the foreign reporters, I say. He is having difficulty understanding what they are doing to them, he says, or what they say they are doing to them. He chuckles, shaking his head. Their incompetence astounds him sometimes. He knows what he means, I say. Over the years, I've become fairly fluent in their language, and I have, over time, developed my own hypothesis, which is that their problem might not be a grammar-derived block to sympathy, but rather total, constant confusion about who the hell anyone is ever talking about. I chuckle sympathetically. He has just the same problem with them. The general's look turns dark. He should feel free to go now, he says. He is staring bullets at me. I am worried that I may have been inadvertently unclear just now, unclear to the point of endangering my own life. He should feel free not to return. The general has one hand on the ringing phone, one hand on his chest. Is he scratching an itch? or fingering a hidden weapon. Dying would be a dumb way to prove my hypothesis, especially when I haven't had a chance to write about it in any of my articles. I drop all pretense of professionalism. He knows his excellent knows no bounds, I say, and he knows he will soon know again the taste of his fresh blood. Luckily, the general gets the quote. His people have only produced one poet, one awful, mean, idiotic poet, so it's not difficult to have a working familiarity with their national literature. He grins broadly. He is right, he says, taking his hand from his chest and waving it at me. God, wind, guns, he says, another reference, the poet's catchphrase. He picks up the phone and he waves me away again. God, wind, guns, I parrot. I scuttle out of his office. My heart hurts with the shame of my brief, pathetic, self-preserving lapse into bootlicking. Fortunately, no one, not my family nor my colleagues, not my editor nor my readers, no one ever has to know my shame. I'm grateful, as I've been before, that the military here has a strict rule against recording devices. I have a story to file, one only partly untrue. I hurry down the palace's long marble hallway to the press room. Thank you.
Tom's story is titled Obstacle to Empathy, which is kind of odd because that's the name of my Christian hardcore band. I had hoped that when Tom started reading his story, that because he was reading about a country without first or second person in the grammar, that he wouldn't be the first or second person to read tonight, because that would have seemed hypocritical, and he wasn't. And then also, that joke that I just made seemed funnier about 15 seconds. The tone of Tom's story, the judges thought was nice and uncertain at the beginning, that they weren't sure whether it was Borges or bananas or both, somewhere in the middle, whether it was creating this alternate world or whether it was just slapstick. And as it resolved and as the story went, the judges were happy with how that happened. They liked the side details, like the fact that Tom's country, the narrator's country, I don't mean to confuse you with your narrator.
It's totally autobiographical.
But Tom's country did this brisk business in artificial limbs for this country at war. Oh, and they also liked the comic timing. That there's a moment where the story mentioned that people were losing these limbs. Then there's a line of dialogue. Then Tom mentioned that his country does a brisk business in artificial limbs. So there was that little dialogue beat in between, which worked well on the page and also well where Tom read it. One of the judges in the printout that we got, Tom had this Tom's narrator, sorry, I keep doing this, had this unsuccessful experiment in bootlicking, but in the printout that we got it said booklicking, not bootlicking. Clearly just a typo, but one of the judges who had to leave because it was her husband's birthday said that she liked the idea of booklicking more than bootlicking and thought it was some weird kind of criticism where you overly praise a writer who you don't like, and she liked booklicking, and that was a little bit let down when it just turned out to be ordinary bootlicking. So, but you point booklicking inadvertently or on purpose. So anyway, by the end, the judges felt the story was successful for the most part in its central conflict, this idea of this country with that had this odd grammar that led to these social consequences. And there's a line at the end that more than two of the judges singled out as being a good way of describing what all fiction does. The judge goes to file the story and he says, I have a story to file, one only partly untrue. So the judges really liked that line and thought that was a great way of just describing what all fiction writers do anyway. So there's Tom's story in my hardcore band.